how do you counter this accusation that Basques are a bunch of terrorists? You have to tell people that Basques are a bunch of writers, they're poets, they're musicians, they're painters, they're sculptors, that Edward Chillida is a Basque, that Jorge Oteiza is a Basque, that Echaga is a Basque. Basques are a very proud people, but they tend to keep it to themselves. The question that I am most commonly asked by non-Basques is, what do the Basques want? Which, to me, is a very funny question. It reminds me of something that we Jews always say, which is that if you have two Jews in a room, you will have 3 points of view. I think Basques may be up to 4. But to really try to answer that question in any way, you have to look at the history, which is a problem I keep getting into. I think of myself as an accidental historian, in that I didn't mean to be a historian. It just seems that history is the only way you can explain things. And in the case of the Basque people, there's a lot of missing history because the Basques, for many years, failed to record their own history. So the first we really hear of them is from the Romans, who gave them the name Basque, which is not a Basque name for Basque people. And the relationship of the Basques to the Roman Empire has actually stood as one of the models to suggest what the Basques want. The Basques lived in the Roman Empire, surrounded by it, and they were able to talk to the Romans about what they were and weren't willing to do, with an eye towards cultural survival, which meant they wanted to keep their language and keep their laws. If the military wanted to pass through, that was fine, but don't stop. We'll live within the empire. You like olives, you like wine, we can make olives and wine and sell them, you know, make some good money off the Roman Empire. But operate as a distinct people with our own traditions. Which is why, when the Roman Empire ended, the Basques were the only non-Romanized people left in that entire part of Europe, in southern Europe. A non-Latin people who had, in a sense, survived the Roman Empire without being at war with it at all, working within it profitably. One of the things that makes Basque history distinct is that it's not a rich place. Those beautiful, lush green mountains don't have a lot of topsoil. We're not great for agriculture, as I'm sure a lot of you know, because a lot of your families came here for that very reason. What used to be called the Basque Sea is not particularly rich in fish because it has a very small continental shelf, which is what fish live on. And so Basques did not have the possibility of food self-sufficiency without going elsewhere. And they were allowed that, which is why when Spain was formed by Ferdinand, the Basques wanted to be outside of Spanish customs so that they could trade with other places and became a trade center. But what's an important thing to remember in all of this history is that there never was a Basque country. There never was a country, a single country that all of the Basques lived under. The Basques had this unique thing that they worked out with whatever power came along to be their own autonomous operation within another country. This existed in France until the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a very strange thing to me in history because it was celebrated for many, many decades afterwards, and still to this day as a great explosion of liberty. And yet it was incredibly repressive. And one of the characteristics of the French Revolution was that it was inclusive of people, of peoples. Basques were welcome, but they were to become French people. It was actually, it was the same thing with Jews. The first country in Europe that gave full rights of citizenship to Jews, but they were expected to act like Christians. And this is where the history of the French provinces and the history of the Spanish provinces start diverging considerably. On the Spanish side, it was accepted that the Basques were a different entity within Spain, responsible for defense of that border, but with their own laws and their own traditions. And this continued until the 1870s, till the Carlist Wars, when Basque rights were taken away. And the interesting thing was that when the Spanish removed the Basque rights, what immediately happened was an explosion of Basque nationalism, not only in the political sense, but in the cultural sense. A huge, what became referred to as a Basque Renaissance. Of operas were written, and lots of classical music, and painting, and kind of a rebirth of the language until the Spanish Civil War, until Franco. When I first knew Basque Country, which was in the last days of Franco, the Spanish side was a very strange place. I never really heard the Basque language. I mean, I used to wonder what this language sounds like. I would sometimes hear people whispering odd sounds, which I thought might be Basque. And on the French side, I could hear it. And, you know, the French side became the place of freedom. When Franco died, I think most people had a tremendous sense of hope, real excitement about what could now happen. And I remember having an interview with Felipe González before he became prime minister, but was, the leading socialist, and it seemed a matter of time till he came to power. And I thought this would be a very good thing. And I was interviewing him about various things he wanted to do, most of which sounded good. And I asked him about the Basques. And his face visibly changed. And his voice changed. And this hostility poured out that it just completely shocked me. And in fact, the rule of Felipe González was not particularly good for the Basques. There was torture, there was kidnappings, there were killings. A strange thing has evolved in this relationship, which is very hard to explain because there is a statute of autonomy, there is a Basque government, so people say, so they have autonomy, so what do the Basques want? It should be pointed out that there was very little Basque input in this statute of autonomy, and that a majority of Basques actually never approved it. On the French side, I see in some ways Basques being in more trouble than they're in on the Spanish side. And that, I think, is in part because, as happened after the Carlist Wars, Basque culture is flourishing in opposition, and the French kill the Basques with kindness. There is this effort to make Basqueness something picturesque for tourists and very harmless. There is no governing entity on the Basque on the French side. There is no Basque département. That's one clear thing that the Basques want. The Basques on the French side would like to have their own département. A département is the local administrative unit, and the Basque provinces are a tiny part of a much larger département in which Basques are a minority. So there is no form of Basque government or Basque leadership. You may think this is a strange example, but I've always believed in food as a great indicator of what's going on with culture. And as I'm sure many of you know, on the French side, especially in Labour, the signature dessert is a gâteau basque, which is a cake stuffed with either cream or ichusot cherries. And I'm absolutely appalled to have discovered that they're starting to make chocolate gâteau basque. Yes. I mean, what better symbol, if you believe in an anthropological sense, as I do, that food is a symbol of what's going on in a society, of the Frenchization of Basque culture than chocolate gâteau basque. And I visited my friend Janine Perroy in Saint-Pé, who is at the opening of my book. And the fascinating thing about her bakery is that they have used the same gâteau basque recipe since the family started the operation in the 1870s. And it's pretty much different from anybody else's gâteau basque, and you realize that it's a 19th century recipe. It's a 19th century concept of a cake, not buttery, something very different. And I, asked for the recipe, and she said to me, I can't give you the recipe. It's the recipe of my family. It would be like giving away the house of my father. And I was so thrilled with that answer. I mean, it was much better than getting a recipe. And I visited her a few weeks ago, and she told me that a local newspaper had gone to her pastry shop, and she's in her 80s, and grilled her for 2 hours trying to get the recipe. And she finally said, "All right, I'll tell you the secret ingredient." And they leaned forward, and she said, "I use fairy dust." And there it was in the paper. Janine Perroy's Gâteau Basque is made with fairy dust. This strong sense of preserving culture is why there are Basques today. This is a very bad moment for Basques on the Spanish side. Increasingly, as I get older, I appreciate how happy I am that I'm not a politician, I'm a writer, because it means that I can just say exactly what I think without putting too much of a varnish on it. And I will tell you that the Spanish government of José María Aznar is in a self-made war of annihilation against the Basque people. Journalists being arrested, newspapers being closed down, people being beaten and tortured who did absolutely nothing. And you think, how can this go on in Western Europe and nobody says a thing about it? Well, I'll tell you how. Because Aznar simply says that the Basques are terrorists. And everybody believes this. I can tell you, you know, my next door neighbor in New York asked my wife if I was supporting terrorists. You know, there is this idea, Basque equals terrorists, you know. ETA doesn't attack, and does the newspaper say ETA attacks? No, they say the Basques attacked. I remember once I was just about to give a talk at the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts, and somebody came bursting in and said, "Did you hear the Basques tried to blow up the Guggenheim?" And I said, "Did you hear the Basques built the Guggenheim?" This idea that all Basques are terrorists is a very potent thing in denying Basques their rights. I remember visiting Reno, and I was getting on a plane for San Francisco, and I had a bag full of my Basque books and a lot of articles and literature that Joseba had given me, and they opened my bag, and I thought, oh God, you know. And this woman starts looking through all this Basque material, and she looks up at me and says, "You know, every time I think of the Basques, I get hungry." And I thought, I kind of like it out west. I think that there are some important things that the Basque diaspora needs to be doing. As a Jew, I am very aware of this concept that it is the diaspora that defends the people. And I think you all need to be very aware of what is going on in Spain these days. And I think you need to make lots of noise about it. I think you need to write your congressman. I think you need to, you know, this should not be going on without anyone saying anything. Voices need to be raised. And the other thing that really needs to be done is, you know, I go to Basque centers and there are these programs like we had last night of Basque music, and all these wonderful cultural things that the Basque people have to offer, and they're never offering it to anybody but other Basques. And the world needs to know, I mean, how do you counter this accusation that Basques are a bunch of terrorists? You have to tell people that Basques are a bunch of writers, they're poets, they're musicians, they're painters, they're sculptors, that Edward Chillida is a Basque, that Jorge Oteiza is a Basque, that Echaga is a Basque. Basques are a very proud people, but they tend to keep it to themselves. You can't afford to. In New York, we are trying, or have a far-off distant dream, I suppose, of an international Basque cultural center. This is not something for New York. This is something, this would be your Basque cultural center. It would be everybody's Basque cultural center. It would be a place in New York City that when people came to New York, they could go to and learn about Basque sculpture or Basque literature or painting. You have to tell people who you are. I wanted to read you something. This was actually something that was sent to me by a reader. It's from the Mexican poet Octavio Paz. And it answers the second most commonly asked question that I get, which is, why do you care? This is what Paz wrote. What sets the world in motion is the interplay of differences, their attractions and repulsions. Life is plurality, death is uniformity. By suppressing differences and peculiarities, by eliminating different civilizations and cultures, progress weakens life and favors death. The ideal of a single civilization for everyone, implicit in the cult of progress and technology, impoverishes and mutilates us. Every view of the world that becomes extinct, every culture that disappears, diminishes the possibility of life. I am very happy that the Basques have managed to survive, and I hope that they continue to survive forever. A man named Esteban Garibay, who was actually the first Basque to ever write about Basque history in the 16th century, was also asked, what do the Basques want? And he said, let us be what we are. And I think that's the answer. Eskerrik asko. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. Yes, sir. Well, I have to confess that I was actually born in a Catholic hospital in Hartford, but I mean, the interesting and difficult question there is, what is a Basque? I mean, you know, somebody, the grandson of an Andaluz who came to work in the steel mills in Vizcaya, is he a Basque? I think that the idea of the Basque government and the idea of the Euskadi part, the three provinces, is to establish a place of Basque culture so that if you live there, you're steeped in Basque culture and you are a Basque. Why shouldn't anybody who lives there and sends their kids to schools where all of the children are taught Euskara not also learn Euskara? There is, I think, a very fortunate effort to get away from the old Sabino Arano racist definition of what a Basque is. I might say that that would be a good idea in Israel also. But you're right that this is very much of an issue in Navarra, where there is a large population that doesn't have a Basque identity and isn't interested in a Basque identity. This is a problem of the Basque government. I mean, do you make it? Is it a place? If it's a place that is steeped in Basque culture, it will be a Basque place, and the people who live there will be Basque. I think you cannot get into this really, I think, horrible mistake that Sabino Arano in the 19th century was in of having this racial definition of a Basque. Racism in any form doesn't work. You know, if a black African ends up for some reason in Vizcaya, you know, he can send his kids to school, they can learn Euskara, they can learn Basque traditions, you know, and be a black Basque. My daughter may become the first Jewish Basque, I don't know. Yes? The question was, when did I start studying the history of Basques, of the Basques, and what led me to do this? Yeah, I first went to Basque country knowing nothing about the history of Basques. As a reporter in Franco times, just looking for something that was happening, because it was amazing how little was happening. I thought this was going to be a great story, you know, these Spanish people resisting Franco, and they were just quietly waiting for him to die. And it seemed a little more active in the Basque provinces, so I went there. And I very quickly got a sense of a different people and a different culture. And I must admit that I thought that a lot of this would vanish after Franco, because I thought the persecution of Basques would vanish. But in fact, there was a flowering of Basque culture once Basques were given the opportunity, and sadly the persecution of Basques didn't vanish either. But I went to Basque country a few times a year, every year, and then for some years I didn't go there in the 80s because I was in Central America and the Caribbean doing other things. And when I went back, I was amazed at how much had been accomplished. I was amazed to see, you know, to hear people walking down the street speaking Basque, and children speaking Basque in schoolyards, and the literature and the publishing and all of these things that had happened. And it was at that point that I started, I just started wondering, how is this happening? And, how have these people survived? Um, and it's a remarkable story. As I said in the beginning, you just inevitably have to go to history to understand the present. Yes, sir.
Somewhere in your book, I recall you having written that there was a theory that the Basque people emanated as a possibility of being the lost tribe, one of the lost tribes of Israel. And it stuck. It got my attention. Would you comment on it?
Well, I believe that was in a section of the book where I was trying to show how many silly ideas about the origins of Basques were around. I think the thing you have to understand about all of this theorizing about where the Basques come from is that most of the people in past centuries who have studied this have been commissioned by the French or Spanish government and had a vested interest in trying to show that the Basques come from somewhere else. But in reality, I can find no reason to think that's true. There is absolutely nothing that indicates that the Basques don't come from exactly where they are now. Probably a bigger area that has now shrunk, but I have not read or seen or heard anything to indicate any reason to think that the Basques come from somewhere else. Yes, sir.
Is the language Basque language like maybe another part of Europe?
No, it's not related to any other language. But you could guess that it probably was, and that the other ones just didn't survive. It was probably, like all languages, part of a family of languages, and it's the only survivor.
I happen to be an anthropologist interested in Basque prehistory.
Uh-huh.
And one of the possible theories, which we'll never be able to prove, but makes sense, is that the Basques crossed at Gibraltar and came out of Africa at least 100,000 years ago. And they became Basque as they went north to Nigeria.
Is this part of the Berber theory?
It could be. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily.
Because there's all this speculation based on blood type that there's some connection with Berbers, but
But it would explain why they are there and nobody else except some Neanderthals are there
uh-huh.
that long ago.
Uh-huh. Of course, there's also, as I understand it, there's no way to know if those prehistoric people, the people who did the cave drawings and all that, were Basques.
Except that Basque DNA can be extrapolated by scientific formulas to 30,000 years ago. And that's when Chauvet was painted, and it's the oldest painting. And the Neanderthals were not in cave paintings.
Right,
And who else was there?
right. But would that have been a recognizable Basque?
Well, proto-Basque.
Right,
Proto.
right, right. Anyone else? Yes.
I want to ask you about today with the President Ibarret's plan for peace, which is creating a tremendous turmoil. The question that's coming up with many people saying, well, what is it that the Basque want with this point? So there are all kinds of theories about why Ibarret is coming up with a peace plan. And he's saying that they have the right to debate the question about how to have peace in that area. And of course, what the opposition is saying is that this is the first step for the Basque demanding independence. The other side says no, it will never happen because they will never get a referendum. And if they do, they will not get the majorities. Like Quebec, they thought there would be a different group. They didn't make it. So my question to you is, how do you see that situation? And do you think that the Basque could have a referendum, could make it as an independent country? And do you think that they can survive as an independent?
Well, You don't want to move on to a more difficult question. I mean, first of all, it's my impression that what he is really looking for is a first step toward peace. I mean, you know, to say this is a first step towards independence, so what are you supposed to do? Any first step you take, somebody will say, oh, that's a first step towards independence. But you have to take a step. You have to do something to stop this complete senselessness. By the way, I am really astounded at how, having followed this since Franco times, I can say that this is the worst relationship between the Basque government and the Spanish government since the death of Franco. There, in fact, seems to be no relationship at all. They're not talking. And that can't stand. I mean, something has to be done. As far as independence goes, a couple of things. First of all, you would have to rewrite the Constitution to even have this referendum, because the Constitution, the current Constitution, is very clear that you cannot make any move towards changing the structure of the state. It would be illegal. It would be a violation of the Constitution to have a referendum on Basque independence, which is unfortunate in a way, because then we could find out how much support there is for it, which isn't really known. I would guess that there isn't a lot of support for it. There is no tradition of it. It is my impression that the majority of Basques want what is the historic tradition, which is to be a community within the whole. Ironically, a concept very similar to the European Union in a way, where you can have your own local operation, but I don't think there are a lot of Basques who are interested in printing their own money. I don't think they want to raise their own army. I don't. You know, it's interesting that this was also, not to get too far off the subject, but this is also where it kind of fell apart in Quebec. Is that they really were talking about something cultural. They weren't that interested in having Quebecois money or having a Quebec army. And, I'm aware of the fact that there are people who would like an independent Ushkadi or Uskalaria. I would be surprised if it were anything like a majority. I think that there is, however, a significant part of the population that would like a working relationship of autonomy as opposed to what they have now, which is a non-working relationship of autonomy. I mean, independence is almost an idea that doesn't really fit into Europe today, and there's also, you know, in this to talk about independence, nobody's asking the French. You know, the French government is somehow left out of this whole thing. So I'd be curious how that would work. I think that the people who say, "Oh, this is a first step towards independence," is just a way of. Look, there are a lot of people that don't want to see a peace process. And a lot of those people are based in Madrid. And it needs to happen. And it's, what do you want to call it, a red herring to say, oh, this is a move towards independence. It's a move to do something to stop this terrible situation. Okay, well, thank you all very much.